Rukshin. It is
Hi,
so,
Cornelia.
it's so nice to finally have this conversation. We've been talking about this before. And so everybody usually knows me who sees me on the social media. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit so that people know who I'm talking to today?
Sure. Thank you so much, Cornelia, for having me. Really excited that we're doing this. So for everyone out there, I'm Rukshin. I am a homeopathic doctor. I come from India, and that's where I got my undergrad homeopathic degree. After that, I went on to do my master's in homeopathy and pediatrics, and post which I did my PhD in the study of autism with children and how homeopathy can benefit children with autism spectrum. And then life got me here with my husband. So I've been practicing homeopathy here in Singapore since the last 4 years now. And I see a host of different kinds of patients, but kids have always been my passion and my interest.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of them, of course, in Singapore with all different kinds of complaints with their allergies and behavioral issues. I see autistic kids as well. And I mean, I'm pretty happy with the way that that Singapore has accepted homeopathy. So far, so good with that.
Yeah, perfect. So I actually couldn't put a face to your glamour that I've heard about for a long time, because I've met people who have worked with you whose children have really made progress. Long before I knew you personally. So I was very excited when I finally met you. And really, I'd like to share with people what homeopathy can do, particularly because, so first of all, I know that you're very passionate about children, but also for the parents, it can make such a big difference. And I really work a lot with people who have attachment trauma or other traumatic experiences, and sometimes I'll get to this point where there's just no penetration possible. And I have made the experience that homeopathy can really help with that, really when the body just doesn't want to let go. And I'm trained in somatic work, right? I do TRE, I do EMDR, and it just cannot cross it sometimes. So this is how we got to talk as well, right? How you can help me. And then very often it's also the parents, particularly with children who have maybe birth trauma, or when the mother went through a traumatic experience during their pregnancy, or children who had previous to the pregnancy with this child, when the parents had abortions or miscarriages, then sometimes you just have this very deeply ingrained traumatic pattern that is very difficult to get across. And I find that very often that relates to ADHD or other behavioral situations. So why don't you share a little bit with everyone how homeopathy can actually support those kind of situations?
Sure. So let me start talking a little bit first about what homeopathy is, because a lot of people have heard about it, but they don't know too much about it. So there are two principles which homeopathy relies on as a method of treatment. It's more than a 200-year-old science that originated back in Germany. And the reason why it's sustained so far is because it's relied itself on very key solid principles and fundamentals. The first one being that we always treat the body as a whole. So whenever we get either mental health issues or physical health issues, we always take into consideration the whole body, the mind, body, soul, spirit, their constitution. Everything has to be studied to understand how to work with this patient. And I feel like that method, I mean, and I think that just purely on the basis of that, we always land up cracking the case. Because rarely do doctors nowadays look at the whole picture. You know, you go to a ENT and he looks at your ear, and you go to a gastro and he looks at your tummy, and no one relates the two. And most of the time, the symptoms show up somewhere, but the issue is actually somewhere else. So just by understanding and learning more about the patient, you know, spending those good 60 to 90 minutes talking to them gives us such an idea of, you know, this person's life, what they've been through. And so we rely heavily on the emotional state of every patient. So even when I get a newborn, even when I get a 1-week-old patient, I always try to figure out, not probably, it's impossible to know the child's mental state, but at least the mother's mental state, you know, when they were pregnant, when they are breastfeeding right now, because emotions are genetic, they are pathological, you know, if not kind of contained and, you know, dealt with correctly, they can lead to a serious pathological condition. So we have to work at that front.
Yeah.
And so that's where homeopathy really, shines, when it can really work on that level. We do have a lot of scope with working with birth trauma, as you mentioned. So we have very commonly used remedies like, the arnica and the calendula, ledum, hypericum, all of those, which are generally a part of a lot of midwife women's, which they give out, as soon as the baby is born, and if there are any complaints. So we can start right from there. So even with a forceps delivery, for example, with the trauma that sometimes comes to the scalp,
that's so impressive. Actually, it's very interesting, because in my work, I often see a story that kind of then is the story of the birth. Like, people who feel forced into stuff all the time. They're very sensitive to pressure, or not physical. It's actually, it translates into an emotional pattern. Right. And I work a lot with storytelling and time traveling, inner child healing, and that works really well. But very often there's this little bit left that I think is really just penetrable with something more energetically, more on a finer level.
Exactly. And so homeopathic medicines, even though they are a physical dose, and so you have to take them orally sometimes or apply them, they work purely at a very cellular, energetic level. We make our medicines from all sorts of things. There are plants, there's animals, there's minerals. We use everything that's available in nature around us. And what we do is we try to see the frequency of each of those elements and try to match it to the frequency of the patient that's sitting in front of us. And so we do that based on the symptoms that the patient is really, kind of translating. And so what happens often with trauma, which we've noticed, is that, from the time that a child is born in today's day and age, there are layers and layers and layers of trauma that get piled up on one another, right? Because the birth sometimes is a traumatic one. And then there are the injections that are given. And then, the way that they deal with the child, taking them away and cleaning them up. And, just from there is that certain emotional impact that kind of builds on to a child.
Absolutely.
And frequently what happens is that, by the time they reach the age of 20, there's so many layers that have gotten built that it's impossible for one modality sometimes to really work, So they need so much of integrative medicine, they need a little bit of counseling, they need the diet advice, they need homeopathy, Sometimes they need to work with a couple of people to really get to, removing one on one layer, to actually reach their inner feeling of, well-being and health.
Yeah, it's also because the body has been so disbalanced then, or never actually reached balance, like homeostasis, right? So that there you have depletion, you have cell imbalances, you have mitochondrial issues, right? So actually what you're saying is so great. It's so important that we rely on these different practitioners who actually help us to kind of bring all levels up to a level where we want to be, right? Because if you only bring one up, then the other one keeps pulling you down. I see that a lot.
Exactly. And so I feel like I work best when I work, with other practitioners, because there's always somewhere, where they feel like they need the help of homeopathy, and I can provide that to them. But then there's a lot of other layers, which need some other specialization, So I in that way, because sometimes you do need, let's say, probiotics, or sometimes you do need, supplemental support along with homeopathic medications. And so I think like a balance of all of that is what really gets the patient really feel like they're taken care of, from every angle. You're not missing anything. And so healing is much faster, and much better.
And actually getting out of that position where people feel really lost because nobody can really help them, right? Because it's really a multi-level task. Okay.
Exactly.
So how do you approach children with behavioral issues? Let's say somebody comes and says they have an ADHD diagnosis. What do you do?
Okay, so I do what I do with every single patient who comes to me, which is the first consult is only understanding what's happening. So starting right from the time that the mother's pregnant, I like to get a pregnancy history, I like to get a birth history, and then I like to get a history of what happened since the child is born. So whether it be how breastfeeding was, how they reacted, did they have nappy rashes, how was digestion, colic. I try to get a hold of the patient's entire journey till that point of time, understand when the symptoms started, were there any triggering factors, because a lot of the times, there's a sudden change that brings on the symptoms. they move countries and the symptoms come on, or, there's a sudden death in the family. And so for homeopaths, that is very, very important, because we have very specific remedies that work on certain kinds of trauma. So for a disappointment in love, we have a different medicine. And for, a death in the family, there's a different medicine, because the trauma and the feeling of both those losses are very different. So yes, so understand all of that, get a list of all the symptoms, try to understand